There are debts the soul accumulates silently, over years, until the weight of them bends a person into a shape they no longer recognize as their own. Lyra felt the ache in her lower back before she felt anything else. It was Tuesday, the 4th of November, and she had been awake since 5 o'clock, and the cold in the stable yard of Ashford Park pressed through her wool cloak like a blade. Not dramatically, not like a sword in a story. Like a butter knife, slow and determined, finding the joint between her shoulder blades and settling there. She had learned not to flinch at cold. Flinching cost energy she did not have. She crossed the yard with the ledger tucked under her left arm, the same ledger she had carried every morning for the past 11 months, and she did not look at the puddles of gray water collecting between the cobblestones, because she already knew which ones would soak through the gap in her right boot, and looking at them would not change the outcome. She looked instead at the horses. The horses were honest. They did not pretend the morning was anything other than what it was. Mr. Croft, the head groom, was already inside the first stable block, moving between the stalls with a lantern. He was a short, broad man who smelled permanently of linseed oil and disapproval, and he had made clear from her first week that he considered Lyra's presence in his yard an offense against the natural arrangement of the world. She was not a groom. She was not a stable hand. She was, technically, the assistant to the estate steward, a position that had never before required its occupant to appear before dawn among the horses. But Mr. Reeve, the estate steward who had hired her, had died in September of a fever that came on fast and left him cold in 3 days. And Lady Ashford, who owned this estate in the 7-year absence of its ducal heir, had not hired a replacement. She had instead handed Lyra a second set of keys and told her that if she expected to keep her salary of 12 shillings a week, she would manage both roles until Lady Ashford saw fit to arrange otherwise. That had been 6 weeks ago. The bay mare threw her shoe again, Mr. Croft said, not looking up from the nearest stall. He said it the way he said most things to Lyra, as though reporting an inconvenience that was, in some fundamental sense, her fault. "I'll note it for the farrier's invoice," Lyra said. Invoice, he said the word back to her with the particular contempt a man reserves for the vocabulary of a woman who does something he has decided women cannot do. Invoice. Very good. Lyra opened the ledger. She had stopped, some weeks ago, expecting him to finish the conversation differently. She wrote the note for the farrier in the margin column she had created for exactly this kind of standing cost, and she moved past him into the tack room, where the morning's real work waited. The accounts of Ashford Park had been kept in a condition that was, charitably, optimistic. Less charitably, they were a record of systematic pillage, dressed in polite accounting language. Before Mr. Reeve died, he had, for reasons Lyra had not yet fully untangled, been recording supply deliveries at inflated rates and paying the difference to a company that did not appear to exist in any directory she could locate. The amounts were not enormous. That was the elegance of it. £3 here, £7 there, the kind of sums that vanished between lines in a ledger no one was reading carefully. Someone had been counting on no one reading carefully. Lyra had been reading carefully for 11 months, and for 6 weeks she had been making notes in a separate book she kept locked in her room in the housekeeper's wing, because she was not yet certain what she was reading, and she was certain that she could not afford to be wrong about it. She lit the tallow candle on the tackroom shelf, set the ledger on the bench, and worked. Outside, the yard was coming to life, the scrape of buckets, the low conversation of the grooms, the particular percussion of horses shifting weight in their stalls. She had come to know the yard's rhythms the way she had once known her father's library, by feel, by the sound of what was missing. What was missing, this Tuesday morning, was the sound of the Duke. He had arrived on Friday. The yard had known before she did. There was a specific quality to the silence that fell over men who have suddenly remembered there is a consequence to their behavior, and it had fallen over the Ashford Park yard at 2:30 on Friday afternoon without warning. Lyra had felt it through the walls of the tack room before she heard the hooves. She had come to the door of the stable block and stood in the frame of it, and she had seen him. He was not what she had expected, though she had told herself she had no expectations. He rode a gray gelding, 16 hands at least, and he rode it the way men ride horses they have earned the right to ride, without demonstration, without adjustment, simply present in the saddle, the way a hand is present in a glove made for it. He was tall. He was fair-complexioned with windburn high on his cheekbones and a jaw that had not been shaved this morning, and his hair was the color of old wheat straw, and none of this was what made the yard go quiet. What made the yard go quiet was his expression. It was not angry. It was worse than angry. It was the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere and is now tallying the distance between what he remembers and what he finds. He was the Duke of Ashford. He was 29 years old. He had been absent from this estate for 7 years, and he had sent no word of his return. The grooms scattered toward his horse like iron filings toward a magnet. Lady Ashford had appeared on the front steps within 90 seconds, which told Lyra that someone had been watching the road. The Duke did not look at the welcoming committee. He did not look at the house. He was looking at the yard. He looked, for a moment, directly at Lyra. She did not step back. She did not drop her gaze. She held the ledger against her chest and held his gaze for exactly the 2 seconds required to establish that she was an employee, not a supplicant. And then she returned to the tack room and to the accounts, because the accounts were due to Lady Ashford by 4 o'clock, and the Duke's arrival did not change that. She heard later that he had not spoken more than 11 words to his mother at supper. On Saturday he had ridden out at 6 in the morning, before anyone in the house was properly awake, and returned at noon. Lyra had noted it the way she noted everything, without interpretation. On Sunday he had ridden out at 7. On Monday, at 7:30. And on Tuesday, at 8:05, she heard the gray gelding's hooves in the yard, and the sound of Mr. Croft speaking in his most creaseless voice, and she did not go to the door. She knew she was being observed because she had been observed before, by people with varying motives, and she had learned to feel it as a temperature shift, a slight warming of the air at the edge of her peripheral attention. She kept her eyes on the ledger. She added the farrier's note to the column of outstanding maintenance costs and drew a line under it and turned the page. Who manages this? It was not a question. His voice was low and unhurried, and it landed in the tack room like a stone dropped into still water. She did not startle. She put her finger on the line she had been reading to hold her place, and she turned and looked at the Duke of Ashford, who was standing in the door of the tack room, with his riding gloves in his left hand, and his gray eyes on the ledger she was holding. "I do," Lyra said. He looked at her for a moment. "Your name?" "Lyra Fenwick, assistant to the estate steward, and currently performing the steward's duties pending Lady Ashford's arrangements for a replacement." Something moved through his expression. Not surprise, something colder. "How long has the position been vacant?" 6 weeks. He looked at the ledger. "May I?" She held it out. He did not reach for it immediately. He looked, first, at the way she had arranged herself in the tack room, the candle's position, the second ledger, the ink, the column of notes in the margin, and then he took the ledger from her hands. He was wearing no ring on his right hand. His hands were large and calloused, in the places a man's hands are calloused when he works them rather than displays them. He read for 3 minutes without speaking. She had timed longer silences. "These margin annotations," he said, "these are yours." "Yes, you've been tracking a discrepancy." "I have been tracking a pattern," Lyra said. "I haven't yet determined whether it constitutes a discrepancy in the legal sense or a record-keeping error. I didn't want to present conclusions I wasn't certain of." He looked up. He looked at her the way men rarely looked at her these days, as though she had said something that required his full attention. "How long have you been here?" 11 months. "And before?" She paused. Not from reluctance. From the discipline of someone who had learned that the full answer to this question usually cost more than it returned. "My father was Edward Fenwick. He was a solicitor of some reputation in Cheltenham. He died 18 months ago and left debts I was not aware of. I accepted the position here because it was offered." She said it flatly. She did not say, "and because there was nothing else." She did not say, "and because I had 4 days to leave my father's house before the bailiffs arrived, and I took what I could carry, and I have not stopped carrying it since." She did not say any of that, because he had not asked. He said, "The farrier's invoice. You've put it in with the outstanding maintenance column." "It's an ongoing cost," she said. That mare throws her shoe at least twice a month. I moved it from the incident column to the structural column in September. It changes the quarterly picture. Something very small and very controlled happened at the corner of his mouth. It does, he said. He handed the ledger back. I'll want to see the full accounts. Both sets. She understood at once that he meant both sets, the official set and the other book she kept locked in her room. By this afternoon, he said. Yes, Your Grace. He was already turning when he said, without looking back, You're doing 2 jobs and being paid for 1. She said nothing. It was not a question, and she had no intention of agreeing with a duke in his own doorway on the subject of her own exploitation. She heard him cross the yard. She heard Mr. Croft say, Your Grace, in the voice he never used with her, and she turned back to the ledger, and her hands were perfectly steady. She told herself they had always been steady. She told herself she was not relieved. On Wednesday, he rode out at 9 o'clock. On Thursday, 9:15. On Friday, he did not ride out at all. She had finished presenting the full accounts to him Thursday evening in the estate office, a room that smelled of tallow and pipe smoke, and the faint, sweet rot of a window frame that had been swelling in its sill for years. He had sat across the desk from her, his desk, technically, though he had offered her the chair as though she were a solicitor rather than a member of staff, and he had gone through both ledgers, line by line, for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He asked questions. She answered them. He did not ask her to simplify. He did not explain anything back to her that she had just said. He asked, twice, for the directory she had tried to find the payments company in, and she produced it both times, and both times he read the relevant section himself. At 10:10, he set down the pen he had been using to mark certain passages and said, You found embezzlement. I've found a pattern consistent with embezzlement, she said. The payment recipient doesn't exist. The quantities invoiced don't match the quantities received. But the signature on the approval forms is Mr. Reeves, and Mr. Reeve is dead. And whoever was working with Reeve knew that his death would complicate any investigation. Yes. He turned to the page she had marked with a strip of brown paper. The page where the approvals stopped matching Reeve's established handwriting. The page, 14 months ago before her time, where the signature began to vary. Someone else was signing, she said. Reeve may not have known, or he may have known, and hadn't the power to stop it. Leander, she had not yet permitted herself to think of him by name, but it happened, alone with her thoughts, past 10 o'clock, in a room that smelled of old wood and candle wax. Leander looked at the forged signatures for a long time. My mother's estate manager, he said, Mr. Calloway. She waited. He manages her private accounts separately from these, or he is supposed to. I don't have access to Lady Ashford's private accounts, Lyra said carefully. No, he said, you wouldn't. He closed the second ledger. He looked at her across the desk. His face in the candlelight was unreachable, the way faces are unreachable when the person wearing them has just arrived at a conclusion they already disliked before they confirmed it. You'll have access tomorrow. She did not ask him to clarify. She trusted that the morning would clarify it. It did. By 9:30 on Friday, Mr. Calloway had been summoned to the estate office. Lyra was present because Leander had asked her to be present, with the ledgers, and she sat at the small side table near the window, as though she were a piece of furniture that happened to contain 2 years of documented financial irregularities. Mr. Calloway was a man of 50-something years, broad through the chest, with a ruddy face, and the particular confidence of a man who had spent a decade being answerable to a woman he considered manageable. He entered the room and saw the Duke, and adjusted, visibly, the way a sail adjusts in a changed wind. He did not see Lyra at first. Your Grace, he said, a welcome surprise. Lady Ashford wasn't certain when to expect you. Sit, Leander said. Calloway sat. Leander set the second ledger on the desk and opened it to the page with the varying signatures. He turned it to face Calloway and placed one finger beneath the earliest irregular signature. He did not speak. Calloway looked at it. His color changed. Not from guilt, or not only from guilt, from calculation, the rapid private arithmetic of a man determining what could be denied and what could not. "I'm afraid I don't see what you're indicating, Your Grace," he said. He had a practiced, flowing voice, ornate with implication, designed to make directness seem rude. These accounts were managed by the late Mr. Reeve, a conscientious man, but I understand he had been unwell for some time before his death. His records may have suffered. Naturally, I'd be delighted to assist in any review, if Your Grace is concerned about the company name on these invoices, Leander said. "Fenmore and Associates, you'll give me its registered address." A pause, very brief. "I'd need to consult my files." "You'll give me the address from memory," Leander said, "since you've been approving payments to it for 14 months. "I don't believe." "The amount," Leander said, "across 14 months, adjusting for the variable invoice totals, is £463. He said it the way a man sets something heavy on a table. "I've asked my solicitor in London to verify the registration. He'll have an answer by Monday. I'd prefer you gave me the address now, because if Fenmore and Associates doesn't exist in any register my solicitor can find, the matter becomes criminal, and the conversation changes considerably." Calloway's face had gone from ruddy to a particular kind of pale. He looked at the ledger, he looked at the Duke. He did not look at Lyra, and later she would understand that the specific cruelty of that, his refusal to see her, even now, was the most honest thing he had done in the whole of this interview. "There may have been errors," Calloway said. His voice had changed. It was still ornate, still flowing, but something had gone out of it, the way air goes out of a room when a window is opened. "Administrative oversights. If Your Grace would allow me to review my own records before." "No," Leander said. The word had no inflection. It was simply a closed door. Lady Ashford appeared in the doorway 11 minutes later. She had clearly been told only that her son required her presence, and she entered with the composed authority of a woman who has managed this house for 7 years and intends to continue managing it. She was handsome, fair-haired, and possessed of a quality Lyra had come to recognize as a kind of controlled desperation dressed in silk. She saw Calloway's face and understood. The silence that followed was 18 seconds long. Lyra counted. "Mother," Leander said. He did not rise. "When you hired Calloway, did you know he had previously left a position in Derbyshire under investigation?" Lady Ashford's chin came up. "I was not aware of." "I have the letter of reference he provided you." Leander opened the top drawer of the desk and produced it. "The solicitor named in this letter has been retired for 9 years. The reference is fabricated." The color left Lady Ashford's face with the sudden finality of a candle snuffed. She sat down in the nearest chair without being invited to, which told Lyra everything about how thoroughly the ground had shifted. Calloway was dismissed from his position before noon. A letter was dispatched to London by the early post. The terms of his departure were explained to him by Leander in 4 sentences, the last of which informed him that if any of the £463 was returned within 30 days, the matter would remain a civil dispute rather than a criminal one. He left the estate before 1 o'clock. Lyra had gathered her ledgers and was preparing to return them to the estate office when Lady Ashford stopped her in the corridor. She stood with the window light behind her, and she looked at Lyra with an expression Lyra had seen before, on the faces of people who have discovered they underestimated someone and are not sure whether to be grateful or resentful. "You found this," Lady Ashford said. It was not quite accusation. It was not quite gratitude. "I found a pattern," Lyra said. His Grace made the connections. "Don't be modest. It doesn't suit a woman who keeps a second ledger in her room." Lyra had nothing to say to that, so she said nothing. Lady Ashford looked at her for another moment. "Reeve recommended you when I wrote, asking if he knew a competent person for the assistant position. I didn't ask why he was so emphatic. I should have." She paused. "I don't know that I've made your time here comfortable." "No," Lyra agreed. Something almost like respect moved across Lady Ashford's face. She stepped aside and let Lyra pass. That evening, Leander found her in the estate office at the hour she usually worked, which was past 7, when the house was quiet. He did not knock, because the door was open, and he stood in the frame of it, the way he had stood in the frame of the tack room door, as though he had learned somewhere to occupy a threshold completely, without blocking it. "You should have been given more help," he said. I managed, she said. You managed 2 positions for 6 weeks, on 12 shillings a week, while documenting evidence of embezzlement in your private time, he said. That's not the same thing. She looked at him. He was in his evening clothes, without the cravat he'd worn at dinner, and his fair hair was disordered at the temple, the way it went when he'd been raking his hand through it, which she had noticed him do when he was thinking. She thought, I should not know that about you. I should not have been watching closely enough to know that. What would you like to say to me? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. He was not, she had learned, a man who filled silences. I want to offer you the steward's position, he said, properly, at the steward's rate, which is £40 a year, with the cottage on the south side of the park, and a proper clerk to handle the day-to-day correspondence. £40 a year. She held the number for a moment inside her chest, and did not let her face show what it meant. It meant the end of the gap in her boot going unmended, because the cobbler cost 2 shillings. It meant a door with a lock on it that was hers, not the housekeeper's spare room. It meant sleeping through a night without calculating the weeks remaining before the next salary. That's a generous offer, she said. It's the correct rate for the work, he said. Then I'll need to think about it. He looked at her. He had. She was beginning to understand. An extensive vocabulary of silences. And this one was surprised. Think about it, he repeated. You've been back on this estate for 6 days, she said. You've resolved a significant problem with admirable speed, but I don't know you well enough to be certain that the position I would be accepting is the one you've described. She watched him absorb this. He was not, she had already determined, a man who absorbed things with visible offense. He absorbed them the way still water absorbs a stone, fully, without splash. That's fair, he said. I'm not being difficult, she said. I'm being careful. There's a difference. I know the difference, he said. And something in the way he said it told her that he did, not from being told, but from experience, from the particular knowledge of someone who has confused the two at cost. Then take the time you need. The offer doesn't expire. He left her to the accounts. She was out of the estate office by 9, which was early for her. The night was clear and genuinely cold, the first real cold of November, and she walked across the yard toward the housekeeper's wing, by a route that took her past the stable block, because she had learned that the horses in the evening had a quality of stillness that was better than most of what she found indoors, and she stood for a moment at the half door of the nearest stall, not touching, just present. She thought about her father's library. She thought about the way she had not cried at his funeral, because there had been 3 men from the bank also present, and she had understood, in the brutal clarity of that morning, that crying in front of men who intend to take your furniture is a luxury you cannot afford. She thought about 11 months. She thought about the second ledger, which she had kept not out of suspicion of Mr. Reeve, initially, but out of a need to see the numbers in a form she could trust, because when you have lost everything to a set of numbers you did not see coming, you learn to watch numbers with absolute care. She thought about Leander, which was a more dangerous thing to think about, and she made herself be precise about the shape of the danger. He was the Duke of Ashford. She was the woman who managed his stable's maintenance accounts. He had just offered her a position that would double her income. Any feeling she allowed herself in that direction would be a complication he had not invited and she could not afford. She told herself this was rational. She was almost certain it was rational. In the morning, Saturday, he was in the yard before she was. She saw him from the far end of the stable block, standing beside the gray gelding's stall, not grooming, not saddling, simply standing with his hand on the horse's neck. The gelding's name was Covenant, she had learned from the grooms, and he and the Duke had the particular understanding of horse and rider who have covered difficult ground together. The gray stood very still and breathed slow. Leander was looking at something she could not see from this angle. She stopped. She did not want to interrupt. He heard her boots on the cobblestones and turned, and he was not startled either. She had noticed that about him from the first day. He did not startle. He settled. "How early do you always arrive?" he said. 5:15, usually. And before the embezzlement, when there was a steward. 6:30, she admitted. He looked at her, morning light, pale and honest, and his face in it was tired in a way his face was not tired during the day. You were working 12-hour days before you inherited a second job. The accounts were in a condition that required it. He looked at Covenant's shoulder. He looked back at her. My father ran this estate until I was 17, he said. After he died, I was 22 before I came back. 5 years away at various necessities, and then I came back and it was already changed. And then I left again because... He stopped. He was not a man who lost the thread of a sentence. He was a man who chose, sometimes, not to complete one. 7 years is a long time to leave something alone. Yes, she said. The accounts are the least of it, he said. She thought of the things she had not said to him yet, the repairs outstanding in the south wing, the tenant contracts that had not been reviewed in 4 years, the kitchen garden that had been half abandoned, the slow accumulated costs of a house managed by someone who had neither the will nor the knowledge to manage it properly. And Lady Ashford had not been negligent out of malice, but out of a kind of helplessness she had dressed as dignity. Lyra had seen it. She had made notes. There's a list, she said, if you want it. I want it, he said immediately. It's organized by urgency and by cost, she said. The most urgent items are the least expensive. The most expensive items aren't urgent yet, but will become urgent by spring. He stared at her. I made it, she said, because Mr. Reeve had started it before he died and left it unfinished, and it seemed wasteful to let the work go to nothing. You made a full estate assessment, he said, in 6 weeks, while managing 2 positions, while documenting an embezzlement. 7 weeks, she said, and it's not a full assessment. The timber accounts need a proper surveyor. He made a sound. It was very small and very low, and she was almost certain it was a laugh. She held the list out. It was not, strictly speaking, hers to offer. She had made it in the expectation that the next steward would receive it. But he was the Duke, and the list was about his estate, and offering it was simply the correct thing to do. He took it and read it in the gray morning light, there in the stable yard with his horse warm at his shoulder, and she watched his face move through the items, the way she had watched it move through the ledger, carefully, without waste. The south wing's roof, he said. March if the winter's harsh, May if it's mild, either way, before summer. The tenant contracts. The Hadley farm hasn't had its lease reviewed since 1807. The rent hasn't increased in 17 years, but neither has the provision for their maintenance obligations. It should be renegotiated. In their favor, I think, if you review the productivity records. He looked up. In their favor. They've improved the yield by 20%, with no reduction in the rent they pay. A fair renegotiation acknowledges that. They'd be more likely to invest in the property further. It's better value long-term. He looked at her for long enough that she wondered if she had overstepped. The timber surveyor, he said. Do you know one? There's a man in Winchester my father used. He's reputable. I can write to him. Do that. He folded the list. He put it inside his coat, at the breast, the place where you put a thing you intend to keep. The position, he said. I've decided, she said. He waited. I'll accept it, she said, on the condition that the terms are written clearly, and I have a proper copy, and that the cottage lease is in my name, rather than the position's, so that if the situation changes, I'm not without a home again. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had come to associate with his arrivals at conclusions he respected, even when they inconvenienced him. Those are reasonable conditions. I know they are, she said. He said, the cottage lease will be in your name from today. The position papers I'll have drawn up by Monday. Thank you, she said. They stood in the stable yard, and the horses were warm and quiet behind them, and the morning light was doing its slow, pale, honest work on everything. Your father, he said, the solicitor. She had not expected him to return to that. He trained you, Leander said. The ledger work, the document reading. Yes, from the time I was 9, he had no sons, and he thought the activity was less foolish than embroidery. She paused. He was right. Yes, Leander said. He was. A beat. She felt the shape of what had not been said, that a woman with her capability, her training, her 11 months of absolute solitary competence, should never have found herself cold in a stable yard at 5 in the morning on 12 shillings a week, and that the distance between her father's library and this cobblestoned yard was not a story about her failure, but about a system's willingness to let capable women disappear into the gap between what they could do and what they were permitted to claim they could do. She did not say any of this. He did not say it either, but it sat between them in the pale cold, acknowledged, the way hard things are acknowledged when the people acknowledging them are both too composed to speak of them directly and too honest to pretend they haven't seen. He said, "I should have come back sooner." She thought he meant the estate. She thought he might mean something larger. She chose to answer the version she was certain of. "The accounts will recover," she said. "They already are." He looked at her. His gray eyes in the morning light were not cold, or not precisely cold. They were the color of still water that has great depth, and she had stopped, somewhere in the past 6 days, being certain that depth was absence. "Covenant needs a ride," he said. "I've been putting it off." "It's a fine morning for it," she said. He returned to the gelding stall. He did not call for a groom. He saddled the horse himself, which she had noted him do before, and which still struck her as notable in a duke, the simplicity of a man who does not require assistance for the things he can do himself. He led Covenant out into the yard and mounted in one clean motion and turned the horse toward the gate. He looked back at her. She had not moved. "The list," he said. "Add whatever I've missed." He paused. "One beat. I have missed things." She did not answer immediately. She watched him settle into the saddle, watched the gray gather itself, watched the gate open ahead of them into the November morning, where the light was coming through the bare oaks in long, honest lines. "I'll add them," she said. He rode out. She stood in the yard until the sound of hooves faded, and then she stood a moment longer, because she was permitting herself a single moment she had not budgeted for. Not triumph, not relief, not the particular satisfaction of a ledger that has finally balanced. Something quieter, something she had not had time for in the 18 months since her father's death. The knowledge that she was still here, that she had not broken under the weight of the things she'd had to carry, that the ledger of her own life, carefully kept through all of it, had arrived at a sum she had not allowed herself to count on. She had not wept at her father's funeral. She did not weep now. She was not built, she thought, for weeping in doorways. She was built for the tack room, and the margin column, and the patient, precise recording of what was real. She picked up the ledger she had set down. She went inside. There was something to add to the list. December brought harder frost, and the surveyor from Winchester and a set of position papers that Leander had written to be, in Lyra's private assessment, unusually favorable, not in a way that embarrassed either of them, but in the way of a man who had determined the correct terms and written them without negotiating himself down from them. She read them twice. She signed them. The cottage on the south side of the park was hers, lease recorded in her name at the county registry, door key on a ring of 3 that she kept in her coat pocket, where she had always kept the estate keys, the weight of it now differently meaningful. The tenants at Hadley Farm were renegotiated in February, terms written by Lyra and reviewed by Leander and agreed by the tenants in a meeting at which he deferred to her to explain the figures, because the figures were hers, and she was learning, a man who gave credit where it was due without requiring to be asked. By March she had a clerk, a young man named Thomas, who was quick with numbers and initially nervous in her presence, and progressively less nervous, as he understood that she was not interested in his deference, but in his accuracy. She liked him. The south wing's roof held through a mild winter, and was contracted for in April. It was April when Leander came to the estate office in the early afternoon, which was unusual. He typically worked at the main house desk in the mornings, and came to the estate office after 6, and he sat in the chair opposite her that had become, through the winter, simply his chair, the one she kept cleared, without either of them having mentioned it. He said, "I owe you something I haven't said." She put her pen down. "When I came back in November," he said, "the estate was worse than I expected, and I'd expected something poor. What I didn't expect was that it was being held together by one person who had every reason to abandon it, and hadn't. He paused. I don't think I said adequately that I saw that. She looked at him. She had spent 4 months in close company with this man's silences, and his questions, and his habit of reading things himself, rather than waiting for a summary, and she had kept very careful accounts of her own feelings, the way she kept all her accounts, honest, and complete, and locked in a separate place she did not open without good reason. You offered me a fair position, she said. That was sufficient. It was the minimum, he said. I'm speaking of something more than the position. She was silent. I would like, he said, with the particular careful syntax of a man who has been composing this sentence for some time, to court you. If that is something you're willing to consider, I'm not asking you to consider it because of gratitude or obligation. I'm asking because I have spent 4 months sitting across a desk from someone I find. He stopped. He was not, she had learned, a man who reached for large words. Extraordinary, he said, is what I find. She looked at the desk between them. She looked at the ledger she had been working on. She thought, with precision, about what she wanted and what she was afraid of, and whether the two were distinguishable. I want you to understand, she said, that if I say yes, it's because I choose to, not because you own the cottage I live in or the position I hold. I know that, he said. And if it becomes something, it needs to be something I can leave if I decide to. I need to know the door is mine. He looked at her very steadily. The lease is in your name, he said. That doesn't change, regardless of what you decide. The position is yours. I've never said otherwise. He paused. Lyra. It was the first time he had used her name without the context of the office, without a question attached to it. Simply her name, said plainly, the way he said everything that mattered to him. I'm not asking you to give up the ledger. I'm asking if you'd be willing to let me sit across from it. She felt the thing she had been keeping locked make a sound, the way a door makes a sound when the wood settles in changing weather, a small, involuntary acknowledgement of pressure. She said, I'm willing to consider it. He said, that's enough. And it was enough, for April. It was enough for the desk between them and the window light and the sound of Thomas in the outer room making notes in the supply column, and the knowledge that the lease was in her name and the accounts were in order and the south wing's roof would hold. By June, she let him take her hand in the park, in the evening, when they walked the south boundary after supper, because they had found, over the winter, that the day's problems were better thought through in motion than in chairs. He held her hand the way he held the reins of his horse, without grip, without pull, simply present. By August she understood that she loved him, and she told him so with the same flat, precise economy she brought to every true thing she said, standing in the kitchen garden in the failing light, with the smell of warm soil and spent lavender around them, and he looked at her with an expression that was nothing like the expression he'd worn on the day he arrived, nothing like the cold calculation of a man counting distances. It was the face of a man who has arrived, after a long absence, somewhere that will hold. He said, I have been in love with you since the tack room. She said, that was the second day. I know, he said. She laughed. It surprised her. Not the feeling, but the sound of it, open and unguarded, the kind of sound she had not made in a long time. He looked at her laughing, and his face did the thing it did when he was not hiding anything, which was that it simply became entirely his, no restraint in it, no management. He said, will you marry me? She thought about the accounts. She thought about the cottage with the lease in her name. She thought about her father's library and the ledgers he had taught her to read, and the fact that there are debts the soul accumulates silently, over years, and that some of them are not debts at all, but deposits. The morning she had not looked away, the second ledger she had kept out of honesty rather than ambition, the list she had made for a steward who had not yet existed, the single moment in the yard she had allowed herself to feel that she was still here. She thought, with a precision she had earned, this is what agency looks like, not rescue, not relief, this. Yes, she said, on the understanding that I keep the accounts. I wouldn't have it any other way, he said. He reached for her hand in the kitchen garden, in the fading August light, and she let him have it, freely, which was the only way she had ever intended to give anyone anything. You know how this feels, perhaps, If you have ever held a thing tightly for so long that you have forgotten what it is to simply set it down of your own choosing, not because it was taken, but because you finally found somewhere safe enough to rest it. That is what Lyra Fenwick, estate steward, half of a partnership written in proper papers with her name on them, felt on that evening in the kitchen garden at Ashford Park. Not rescue, agency. The great difference between the two is that one ends in gratitude, and the other ends in this, in standing on your own ground, having chosen.